Welcome to Relative Our Family Mess. This is the ultimate space where we dive deep into the raw power, dramatic perspectives, and compelling stories that define a man's true character. If you are looking for bold breakthroughs and high-octane energy, you have come to the right place. I welcome you to today's brand new video. The man who took my daughter came to my house the morning she disappeared. He helped me search the yard. He held me while I cried. He stayed 6 hours. Then he called me every month for 21 years, telling me she was still out there somewhere. He knew. He had always known. His name was Dennis Craw. He was my best friend. This is the story of the night I finally found out. I've been running soundboards for 31 years. I know every creak in this building. The way the heating system kicks on at 11 every night and rattles the ductwork above the mixing console. The way the fluorescent light in the hallway flickers twice before it steadies. The way silence in an empty recording studio isn't really silence at all. It's just the absence of people, which is a different thing entirely. I know all of it because I'm always the last one here. That's not a complaint. It stopped being a complaint a long time ago. After Sarah died, coming home to an empty house felt like walking into a room where someone had rearranged all the furniture in the dark. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Nothing felt right. The studio was easier. The studio made sense. Faders and frequencies and the clean logic of sound. These things don't change on you. They don't leave. So I stay late. Have for 15 years. It's just what I do now. It was a Tuesday in October when Ellie Craw walked into my life. Not dramatically. Not the way things happen in movies, where the music swells and the lighting shifts and you somehow know that everything is about to change. She just pushed open the studio door at 11:45 at night, set her bag down on the chair by the piano, and sat down like she'd been coming here her whole life. I was in the booth, glass between us. She couldn't see me in the dark. She was 28 years old, new to Nashville, new to this studio. I'd been told she was talented. One of those singers who came up through the Atlanta music scene and decided she was ready for something bigger. I'd worked her session earlier that evening, standard stuff, vocal warm-ups, running through the arrangement with the band. Professional, unremarkable. I'd gone back to the booth afterward to finish logging the session notes, and everyone else had gone home. I didn't think much of it when she came back. Artists do that sometimes. They leave something behind. A jacket, a phone charger, a lyric sheet they can't stop thinking about. I figured she'd grab whatever she forgot and head out. She didn't grab anything. She just sat down at the upright piano in the corner of the live room, the old one we keep around mostly for atmosphere, slightly out of tune, more sentimental than functional, and she rested her hands on the keys without pressing them. Just sat there for a moment in the quiet, the way someone sits when they're trying to remember something just out of reach. I kept working, logging timestamps, half watching her through the glass the way you half watch a television that's on in another room. Then she started to play. It wasn't much at first, just her right hand, picking out notes slowly, testing something, the way musicians do when they're chasing a melody that exists in their head but hasn't fully arrived yet. I wasn't paying close attention. I had a screen full of session data in front of me and a deadline for the mix notes. Then I heard it. 7 notes. I stopped typing. My hands went still on the keyboard. I don't think I was breathing. I'm not sure I was capable of it in that moment, because what I was hearing was not possible. It was not something that could be happening in a recording studio in Nashville on a Tuesday night in October. It was not something that could be coming from the fingers of a 28-year-old woman I had met for the first time 6 hours ago. 7 notes. A simple ascending phrase, gentle at the top, resolving into something that felt like a question left unanswered. I had written those 7 notes in the spring of 2003, sitting at a second-hand keyboard in the spare bedroom of a house we don't own anymore, trying to put together something soft enough to settle a restless 7-year-old who refused to sleep unless someone was singing to her. I never wrote it down, never recorded it, never played it for anyone outside that house. It existed in exactly 2 places in the world in my memory, and in the memory of the only other person who had ever heard it. My daughter Anna, who had been missing for 21 years. Ellie played the phrase again, unhurried, like she was turning it over in her hands, examining it from different angles. She had no idea what she was playing. That much was clear. She wasn't performing it. She was discovering it, the way you hum something in the shower that you can't quite place, that feels like it came from somewhere deep and old and not entirely your own. I pushed back from the console. Slowly, the way you move when you're afraid that any sudden shift in the atmosphere might shatter something. I stood at the glass and watched her play those 7 notes again. 31 years in this business. I've heard thousands of songs. I've sat in the dark behind glass and listened to voices that could stop your heart. I know what music can do to a person. I know the difference between something that moves you and something that breaks you open. This broke me open. I hadn't heard that melody in 21 years because I never finished writing it. I got through 7 notes the night I first played it for Anna, and then she finally fell asleep, and I never went back to complete it. It just lived there, unfinished, in a part of my memory I didn't visit often because visiting it cost too much. I only ever played it once. The last night Anna was still home. Let me tell you about the night before everything ended. February of 2003 was cold in Nashville. Not the kind of cold that makes the news, just the ordinary gray cold of a southern winter that can't quite decide if it wants to commit. Sarah had made chili for dinner. I remember that specifically the smell of it when I walked through the front door after a session that ran 2 hours over schedule. The way it hit me before I even had my jacket off. Cumin and black pepper, and something sweet she always added that I could never identify, and she would never tell me. Anna was at the kitchen table doing homework. 7 years old. 2nd grade. Convinced that long division was a personal attack designed specifically to ruin her life. She had her tongue pressed to her upper lip the way she always did when she was concentrating hard on something. Sarah was at the stove, stirring, not looking up when I came in, just saying, "Wash your hands before you touch anything," the same way she said it every night. That was our life. That was the whole of it. And it was enough. It was more than enough. After dinner, I did the dishes, while Sarah helped Anna finish the homework. I could hear them at the table behind me. Sarah's patient voice walking Anna through the same problem 3 different ways until something clicked. And then Anna's laugh, when it finally did. That particular laugh she had that started small and then surprised her by getting bigger. I stood at the sink with my hands in warm water and thought, without even meaning to, that I was the luckiest man I knew. I was 41 years old. I had a job I loved, and a wife who was smarter than me in every way that mattered, and a daughter who still wanted me to tuck her in at night. I had not yet learned that luck is not a permanent condition. Bedtime was a negotiation. Same as always. Anna wanted one more episode of whatever show she was working through. Sarah said no. Anna appealed to me. I deferred to Sarah, which Anna accepted with the dramatic resignation of someone twice her age. We went through the routine teeth. Pajamas. The specific arrangement of stuffed animals that had to be exactly right, or sleep was apparently impossible. Then she asked me to play something. She always asked me to play something. I'd been doing it since she was an infant, just sitting on the edge of her bed, with whatever small melody came to me. Something soft and unhurried. Something that said, "The day is finished, and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do tonight but rest." I didn't have an instrument in her room. I just hummed or sang quietly. Or sometimes I'd have my old travel keyboard propped against the wall, and I'd play so softly it was barely sound at all. That night I had the keyboard. I sat down on the edge of her bed, and I started to play something I'd been turning over in my head for a few days. Just a fragment. 7 notes that felt like they wanted to go somewhere, but hadn't figured out where yet. I played them once. Anna went still in that way children go still when something catches them completely. She said, "Play that again." So I did. And again. By the 4th time through, she had her eyes closed, and her breathing had slowed, and by the 7th time, she was asleep. I sat there in the dark for a few minutes after, just listening to her breathe. I never went back to finish that melody. The next morning, she was gone. I've tried many times over the years to reconstruct exactly what happened. The sequence of it. I got up at 6:15, made coffee, started breakfast, called up to Anna at 6:45 the way I always did. No answer. Assumed she hadn't heard me. Called again. Went upstairs. Her room was empty. Bed made, which was unusual. Anna never made her bed. Back door unlocked, which was also unusual. We kept it locked. Always. I called Sarah down from the shower. We searched the house, the yard, the neighbors' yards. Called Anna's name up and down the street in the gray February morning, while our neighbors watched from their windows. Someone called 911. I think it was Sarah. I don't fully remember. The police came. Questions started. When did you last see her? Was anything unusual? Does she have any reason to leave on her own? She was 7 years old. She had no reason. She had no anywhere to go. I called Dennis at 7:42 in the morning. I know the time because I still have the phone records from that day. I've looked at them more times than I can count. Dennis Craw, my best friend for 15 years. The man who stood next to me at my wedding and caught me when I tripped on the altar steps and turned it into a joke so smooth that half the guests didn't notice. I called him because he was the person I called when things went wrong. That was just the truth of our friendship. He was that person for me. He answered on the second ring. I told him Anna was missing. My voice broke on the word missing. He said he was on his way. He was at my front door in 10 minutes. I lived 23 minutes from Dennis on a good day with no traffic. I know that because I'd driven it hundreds of times. 23 minutes. Minimum. He made it in 10. At the time, I didn't think about it. I was standing in my driveway in February, cold, without a jacket, watching a police officer string yellow tape across my back fence. And Dennis pulled up and got out of his car and put his arms around me, and I held on to him like he was the only solid thing left in the world. I didn't think about the drive time. I didn't think about anything except that my daughter was gone, and I didn't know how to exist inside that fact. I know now what I didn't know then. Didn't know. Dennis Craw was already in his car before I called him. I think a little more research needs to be done before writing a story like this. As soon as she had reported the credit card's inappropriate use, it would have been shut down. What parent is so stupid that they would hand over 3 credit cards to begin with? If she was confident in her intentions, she wouldn't need your glass switching. It just exposed how far she was willing to go. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the booth until 2 in the morning, staring at the session notes on my screen without reading them. The words were there, but they weren't registering. My mind kept pulling me back to the live room, to Ellie at the piano, to those 7 notes moving through the air like something that had no business existing outside of my own memory. At some point, I turned off the console and drove home on autopilot, the kind of driving you do when your body knows the route well enough to handle it without your full participation. I sat at my kitchen table until 4, made coffee I didn't drink, watched the window go from black to gray to the pale, uncertain light of early morning. I kept running the same sequence through my head, the same careful and circular argument a man makes with himself when he desperately wants something to be true and is equally desperate not to be wrong about it. 7 notes. Specific notes. In a specific order. At a specific tempo. Not a common phrase. Not something that existed in any song I'd ever heard before or since. Something I had assembled from nothing on a cold night in 2003 for an audience of 1. The probability of another person arriving at exactly that sequence by accident was not something I could calculate precisely, but I understood probability well enough to know the number was very small. Very small in a way that meant something. I was at the studio by 7:30 in the morning, 2 hours before anyone else arrived. I pulled Ellie Craw's contract file from the front office. Standard stuff, personal information, tax documentation, the session agreement she'd signed when she booked the block of time. I read through it at the front desk with the lights still off and the morning coming gray through the windows. Her full name was Eleanor Marie Craw, born in Atlanta, Georgia, in the year 2000, 28 years old. She'd grown up there, done some regional work in the Atlanta music scene through her early 20s, relocated to Nashville 14 months ago. No prior recording contracts, no major label interest yet, though a manager named Vic Tilson had submitted her name to 2 imprints in the past year. Next of kin listed as Dennis Craw, father, Nashville, Tennessee. I read that line 3 times. Dennis Craw, father, Nashville, Tennessee. I set the file down on the desk, picked it up again, read it again, set it down again. I stood in the dark front office of my own studio and felt something shift in my chest in a way I couldn't name yet, something that was too large and too dangerous to look at directly. So I didn't look at it directly. I filed it away in the part of my mind where I put things that need more information before they can be properly understood. I went back to the booth and I waited. The session was scheduled for 10. Ellie arrived at 9:50, which told me something about her people who arrive early for studio time, take the work seriously. She had coffee in a thermos and a notebook with handwritten lyric sheets sticking out of it at irregular angles. She set up in the live room without much fuss, did her own vocal warm-up without being asked, and was ready to go before the session musician who was supposed to be playing guitar had even parked his car. I watched her through the glass. I was not watching her the way a father watches a daughter. I want to be honest about that. I didn't know yet what I was watching. I was watching her the way I watch anything I'm trying to understand carefully, without conclusions, collecting data. The way she held her shoulders when she sang, relaxed but not loose. The way she closed her eyes on the high notes, not for effect, but because she genuinely needed to go somewhere internal to find them. The way she tapped her left foot in a pattern slightly off the main beat, some private counter rhythm she was keeping for herself. These things were familiar to me. I couldn't have told you why, exactly. Not yet. They just registered as familiar in the way that certain smells or certain lighting conditions register as familiar something in the body that knows before the mind catches up. The session ran until 1 in the afternoon. During the break, I made a point of being in the live room when Ellie was getting water from the cooler by the door. We talked for maybe 4 minutes. I asked about her influences. She gave me a list that was more interesting than most. We had a brief and genuine exchange about the specific challenge of recording vocals in a room with too much reverb. She was direct without being abrupt, confident without performing confidence. At one point, she set down her water bottle and pushed the sleeve of her flannel shirt up to her forearm to check her watch. I saw the scar inside of her left wrist. Small, crescent-shaped, the pale silver white of old scar tissue that has been there long enough to fully settle into the skin around it. Anna fell off her bicycle in the summer of 2002. She was learning to ride without training wheels, which she had decided needed to happen immediately and completely, and with no gradual process of any kind, because that was how Anna approached most things. She went too fast on a patch of loose gravel in the driveway, went down hard on the asphalt, and opened a crescent-shaped gash on the inside of her left wrist that required 4 stitches at the urgent care clinic on Charlotte Avenue. I carried her into that clinic. I held her hand while they numbed it. I watched them close it and listened to her tell me with absolute seriousness, through her tears, that she was going to try again the very next day. And this time, she was going to make it. She did make it. The next day. She rode the length of the driveway and back, no hands for the last 10 feet, and looked at me over her shoulder with an expression of pure and total triumph. I looked at the scar on Ellie Craw's wrist, and I could not breathe. The scar was from a fall off her bike when she was 6 years old. I know that because I was the one who carried her to the clinic. I still remember the exact weight of her in my arms. I still remember the way she stopped crying somewhere between the driveway and the car because she decided that crying was not the appropriate response to a situation she intended to conquer the very next morning. I excused myself from the conversation, walked to the back hallway, stood with my back against the wall and my eyes closed, and counted my own breaths until I had enough of them to function. I'd 31 years of professional experience keeping my face neutral in difficult moments. I used every single one of them. I drove home after the session ended and sat in my truck in the driveway for 20 minutes without going inside. The engine ticked as it cooled. The neighbor's dog barked twice at something in the yard next door and then went quiet. October light was going flat and orange across the rooftops. Normal Tuesday evening in a normal Nashville neighborhood. The world entirely indifferent to the fact that everything I thought I understood about the last 21 years had just rearranged itself into something I didn't recognize. I had a decision to make. Not about what to do that would come later, and it would require more than one evening and more than what I currently knew. The decision I had to make right now, sitting in my truck in the driveway, was simpler and harder at the same time. I had to decide whether I was going to call Dennis that night the same way I always called Dennis, or whether I was going to let the silence stretch and signal something I wasn't ready to signal yet. I went inside. I made dinner I didn't eat. At 8:45, I picked up my phone and called him. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, brother, how's the week treating you?" Same as always. That particular warmth in his voice, the ease of it, the way he said brother, like it was punctuation, like it was just a word that meant nothing and everything at the same time. I had heard that warmth for 36 years. I had trusted it completely. I listened to it differently now. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. He asked about a session I'd mentioned the previous week, whether the artist had come back with the revisions to the arrangement. I said yes. Mostly. He asked about the plumbing issue I'd had in the back bathroom the month before. I said the contractor had finally finished. He told me about a problem he was having with a client at work, someone who kept disputing invoices for no clear reason. And I made the appropriate sounds of sympathy and solidarity normal. All of it completely normal. And then I started listening for the thing that wasn't there in 20 minutes of conversation. Dennis did not ask about Anna. He never did. Not directly. Not anymore. In the early years, he had carefully, gently, the way you ask about something painful when you genuinely want to know. But somewhere around year 10, the direct questions had faded out and been replaced by something more indirect. He would mention the tip line occasionally. He would say something like, "If there's ever anything I can do, you know I'm there." But he stopped asking what the investigators had found. Stopped asking whether there were any active leads. Stopped asking the questions that a man who genuinely wanted the case solved would naturally keep asking. I had never noticed this before. I want to be honest about that. It had never once occurred to me to notice what Dennis wasn't asking. I was too busy being grateful for what he was providing, which was presence and consistency and the specific comfort of someone who didn't need the situation explained. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about it carefully. I thought about all the conversations we'd had over 21 years and tried to remember a single instance of Dennis asking me what a specific investigator had reported, what a specific lead had produced, whether the FBI had followed up on a particular tip. I could not find one. Not one clear memory of Dennis asking me what had actually been found. He asked how I was feeling. Always. Every time. He was extraordinarily attentive to how I was feeling. But he never asked what I had learned. I went to the hall closet where I keep the storage boxes from the old house. There are 4 of them. Banker's boxes, sealed with packing tape that's yellowing at the edges. Photographs mostly. Things I couldn't throw away and couldn't look at regularly. I pulled the second box down and opened it on the kitchen table. I found the photographs from Anna's 6th birthday party, June of 2002. I had looked at these before, over the years, but not the way I looked at them now. Now I was looking for something specific. I went through them one by one under the kitchen light. Slowly. The way you go through evidence when you finally understand. That's what it is. There were 11 photographs where Dennis was visible in the frame. In 7 of them, he was doing what everyone else was doing, watching Anna. Laughing. Holding a paper plate. Being a normal adult at a child's birthday party. But in 4 of them, he was doing something else. In 4 of them, his eyes were on Anna in a way that was separate from the general attention of the group. Not predatory. I want to be careful about the word I use. Not predatory, but focused. Private. The gaze of someone tracking something the rest of the room isn't aware of. I laid those 4 photographs out in a row on the kitchen table and looked at them together. Then I looked at the dates. June of 2002. Dennis had been turned down by the adoption agency approximately 4 months earlier. He was standing in my backyard, eating my food, watching my daughter with eyes that were doing something I had never thought to examine. And somewhere in the intervening 4 months, something had happened inside him that I will never fully understand, because I am not built the way he is built. I stacked the photographs carefully and put them back in the box. Sealed it. Returned it to the closet. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote 3 words at the top of a blank page. What do I know? I wrote for 40 minutes. By the end, I had 2 pages of notes, a timeline that held together in a way I didn't want it to hold together, and the name of a private investigator I'd heard about from a colleague 3 years ago. Someone who specialized in cases that other investigators had failed to close. Someone who, a colleague had mentioned in passing, was particularly good at finding things that had been deliberately hidden rather than simply lost. I tore the pages out of the notepad, folded them, put them in my shirt pocket. In 21 years, Dennis had never once asked me what the investigators actually found. He only ever asked how I was feeling. I used to think that was what made him a good friend. Now I understood exactly what it made him. The investigator's name was Ray Kowalski, 54 years old, former Nashville Metro Police, 12 years on the force before he went private. My colleague who had mentioned him described him as someone who was good at finding things that had been put somewhere specific rather than simply misplaced, which was a careful way of saying he understood the difference between a cold case and a covered one. I called him the morning after I made my notes. We met that afternoon at a diner on Nolensville Pike that he suggested, a place with good coffee and enough ambient noise that a conversation at a corner booth wouldn't carry. He was a compact man, economical in his movements, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent years watching other people without being watched back. He ordered black coffee and didn't touch it while I talked. I told him what I needed without telling him everything I knew. I said I was trying to locate adoption records for a woman named Eleanor Marie Craw, 28 years old, born in Atlanta in the year 2000, adopted sometime in 2003 by a couple named Dennis and Carol Craw, currently of Nashville. I said the adoption had likely been processed through a private agency or law firm in the Atlanta area. I said I needed to know the details of the original placement where she came from, who had filed the paperwork, and what name she had been living under before the adoption was finalized. He asked me one question. He asked if I expected to find that the adoption had been conducted legally. I told him I didn't know, which was the most honest answer I had. He said he'd be in touch. The next 3 days at the studio were some of the longest of my life. I ran sessions on autopilot, making the technical decisions I'd been making for 30 years without much conscious effort, while the part of my mind that wasn't running faders and adjusting levels was turning the same set of facts over and over and arriving at the same set of conclusions that I wasn't yet ready to act on. Ellie was in the studio on Thursday for a 4-hour session working on 2 songs she wanted to take to a label showcase the following month. I watched her work. Not covertly, I was the engineer. Watching was literally my job, but with a different quality of attention than I'd had before. I was watching her the way you watch someone when you're trying to reconcile 2 versions of them that don't yet fully overlap. The woman in front of me, professional and focused and entirely her own person. And the child in my memory, 7 years old, who had fallen asleep to 7 unfinished notes on a February night that I had been living inside ever since. During the lunch break, she poured coffee from the studio's communal pot and leaned against the counter while I was logging the morning's work at the front desk. She asked how long I'd been running this particular room. I told her 11 years. She asked if I'd always worked in Nashville. I said yes. My whole career. Never had much interest in going to New York or Los Angeles. Nashville suited me. She said she understood that. Said there was something about the city that felt like it was built for people who were serious about the work rather than serious about being seen doing the work. I said that was a good way to put it. She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the parking lot. Then she said her dad had always pushed her toward Nashville. Said he used to tell her that if she was going to do this seriously, this was the place to do it. She said it with the particular warmth people use when they're talking about someone who believed in them before they believed in themselves. Uncomplicated affection. The kind you don't examine because it has never given you reason to. My dad always said music finds you when you need it most. I said that sounded like good advice. She nodded and refilled her coffee and went back into the live room. And I sat at the front desk and looked at the session log on my screen without reading it for approximately 4 minutes. That was Thursday. Kowalski called Friday morning at 7:50 while I was still in my truck in the studio parking lot, finishing the last of my drive-through coffee. I answered before the second ring. He had found the adoption file. He said it had taken some doing because private adoptions in Georgia from that period were sealed under standard confidentiality provisions, and accessing even the administrative shell of such a record required navigating a particular combination of channels that he declined to specify in detail. I didn't ask him to. Some things you accept without the explanation. The file had been processed through a law firm in Atlanta, a firm called Mercer and Holt, specializing in private family law, in business from 1991 through 2009, when the senior partner retired. The adoption had been finalized in October of 2003. The child listed in the filing was a female. Age 3. Given name changed at the time of adoption to Eleanor Marie. Previous name listed in the sealed portion of the record, which Kowalski had not yet been able to access directly. Father's name on the adoption filing: Dennis Allen Craw. Mother's name: Carol Jean Craw. Address at time of filing: a street in Brentwood, Tennessee, that I recognized immediately as the neighborhood where Dennis and Carol had lived before they bought their current house. I sat in my truck and looked at the name on my phone screen where Kowalski had texted it as a follow-up to the call, just so I could see it in writing. Dennis Allen Craw, his full legal name on a document that had erased my daughter's identity and replaced it with his own. His name on a piece of paper filed 8 months after Anna disappeared, in a city he had told me he visited for work, processed through a firm that had apparently asked very few questions about where a 3-year-old girl with no documented history had come from. 8 months. He had waited 8 months after taking my daughter before he signed his name on a piece of paper calling her his. Kowalski came back with more 2 days later. I had asked him, after the first call, to keep going, to find whatever else there was to find about the timeline, specifically about Dennis's movements in the months surrounding Anna's disappearance. I told him I was looking for travel records, financial transactions, anything that would establish where Dennis had been and when. He didn't ask me why. That quality of professional discretion was part of what I was paying him for. He met me again at the same diner on Sunday morning. This time, he brought a manila folder. He set it on the table between us and let me open it myself, which I understood as a small courtesy, giving me control over the pace at which I absorbed what was inside. The first document was a credit card statement. Dennis's name. A card from a bank I recognized as the one he'd used for years. Dated September of 2003. There was a charge on September 9th for a one-way flight from Nashville to Atlanta on a regional carrier. There was a charge on September 17th for a return flight. Same route, same carrier. There were 3 charges in between: a hotel near the airport, 2 restaurant meals, a gas station on the south side of the city, 8 days in Atlanta. September 9th through September 17th of 2003. 6 months after Anna disappeared, I had known Dennis was traveling during that period. He had told me it was a work trip, something to do with a corporate client who had offices in Georgia and needed someone to handle a policy renewal in person. I had not thought to question it. Why would I have Dennis traveled occasionally for work? It was a normal part of his job. I was consumed with my own situation and grateful, in the way of a drowning man, that the people around me were continuing to function normally. The second document was a financial record that Kowalski described, when I looked up at him, as something he had obtained through channels he preferred not to detail and that I should not ask about in any context that involved other people being present. I nodded. The document showed a wire transfer from Dennis's personal account on October 3rd of 2003. The recipient was listed as Mercer and Holt, attorneys at law, Atlanta, Georgia. The amount was $11,400. $11,400. Wired to the law firm that had processed my daughter's adoption. 12 days before the adoption was finalized, I set the document down on the table. picked up my coffee. Put it down without drinking it. Kowalski said, quietly, that there was one more thing. He slid a single printed page across the table. It was a summary he had compiled himself, based on records he had cross-referenced from multiple sources. A timeline laid out in plain language, beginning in February of 2002 and ending in October of 2003. February 2002. Dennis and Carol Craw denied by adoption agency. Financial threshold cited as primary reason for rejection. June 2002. Anna Drummond's 6th birthday party. Dennis Craw in attendance. February 2003. Anna Drummond reported missing. Nashville Metro Police. Case number on file. September 9th through 17th. 2003. Dennis Craw travels to Atlanta, Georgia. Hotel accommodation near Hartsfield Airport. Multiple local transactions. October 3rd. 2003 wire transfer. $11,400. Dennis Craw to Mercer and Holt attorneys. October 15th. 2003 adoption of Eleanor Marie finalized. Mercer and Holt attorneys. Atlanta. Adoptive parents listed as Dennis Allen Craw and Carol Jean Craw. Brentwood, Tennessee. I read it twice. The second time slowly. The way you read something you are hoping will change between readings. It didn't change. He planned this for at least a year before he took her. Kowalski said it without inflection, the way experienced investigators deliver conclusions that are terrible but certain. This wasn't impulsive. He didn't see an opportunity and take it. He saw your daughter. He assessed the situation. And he spent approximately 12 months determining how to do what he had decided to do. The adoption agency rejection was in February of 2002. Anna disappeared in February of 2003. Exactly 12 months. I looked at the timeline on the table. 12 months of sitting across from me at bars and ball games and backyard cookouts. 12 months of being the friend who showed up, who listened, who was always there. 12 months of looking at my daughter and calculating. And then the moment arrived, whatever specific moment he had been waiting for. Whatever alignment of circumstances he had identified as the right conditions, and he moved, and then he came back. That was the part that kept returning to me as I sat in that diner with the document spread in front of me. He executed his plan, and then he drove back to Nashville, and he came to my house, and he held me while I fell apart, and he helped me put up the missing person flyers, and he sat with me in the hospital when Sarah's grief became physical, and he called me at 2 a.m. for 21 years. He came back, and he stayed. I thought about the kind of discipline that required, the specific architecture of a mind that could do what he had done, and then return to the scene of it and maintain, for 2 decades, the performance of a man who had nothing to hide. The patience of it, the coldness of it dressed up as warmth, the calculation dressed up as loyalty, the control dressed up as love. I thought about Sarah, about the way she would sometimes go quiet during Dennis's visits in the years after Anna disappeared. A particular quality of quiet I had attributed to grief, to the weight of the loss settling over her in the presence of someone who had known Anna too. I wondered now what she had seen in those moments, whether some part of her had been asking a question she couldn't bring herself to finish. Kowalski was watching me from across the table with the patience of a man who had delivered bad news before and understood that sometimes people needed a few minutes inside it before they were ready to talk about what to do next. I folded the timeline, put it in my jacket pocket. He sat at the boarding school in Atlanta, I said. He watched your family and he waited. Kowalski nodded once, That's what the records show. He had already picked the city. He had already identified the law firm. All he needed was the right moment. He waited until you were distracted enough that the window would open. He said it without judgment. Just the clean and terrible logic of what had happened. I left the diner without finishing my coffee. Sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time. The morning was gray and cold and completely ordinary, and I sat inside the ordinary morning with the knowledge that the most deliberate betrayal of my life had been planned with the same patience and precision that I had always associated with Dennis's best qualities. He had used everything I trusted about him to do the thing I could never have imagined him doing. I drove home from the diner and went directly to the back bedroom, the one I used as a storage room now, the one that used to be Anna's. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and I stayed there for a long time. There is a specific quality to the silence of a room that used to belong to a child. It's different from ordinary silence. It has a texture to it, a weight that ordinary empty rooms don't have. I had not spent much time in that room over the years. It hurt in a way that didn't get easier with repetition. So I had mostly stopped trying. But that afternoon, I needed to be somewhere that was honest about what had been lost. And that room was the most honest place in the house. The carpet was the same. Light blue. Anna's choice. Selected with great seriousness from a sample book when she was 5 years old and we were redoing the floors. She had sat cross-legged on the living room rug, with the sample book open in her lap, and considered each option with the focus of someone making a consequential decision. She chose the light blue because, she explained, it looked like the color the sky turns right before it gets all the way dark, which was her favorite time of day. I sat on that carpet for a long time and thought about Dennis, not about what he had done. I had been thinking about what he had done for 3 days, and I understood it as completely as I was going to understand it. I thought about who he was, who I had believed him to be, and who he had actually been, and the distance between those two things, which was vast in a way I was still mapping. 36 years of friendship. Or what I had called friendship. What he had called friendship, presumably, though I was no longer sure I understood what words meant to him. 36 years of showing up, of being present, of being the person I called when things went wrong. I had told him things I had told no one else, had trusted him with the specific interior geography of my grief in a way I had never trusted anyone except Sarah, had believed, in the way you believe the things that have been consistently true for decades, that this man's loyalty was real and permanent and unconditional. He had used that belief as a tool. That was the cleanest way I could put it. He had cultivated my trust over 15 years before Anna disappeared. And then he had used it as a tool to stay close, to manage information, to maintain his position inside my grief where he could monitor and control it. Every call at 2 a.m, every she's out there somewhere, brother. Every year of being the one who stayed when other people drifted away. All of it was management. All of it was a performance sustained over 2 decades by a man who understood that the best place to hide is inside someone's trust. I got up off the floor when the room went dark, made dinner on autopilot, ate half of it, cleaned up. At 11:47, my phone rang. Dennis. I looked at the screen for 5 full seconds. Then I answered, "Hey, brother." His voice was exactly what it had always been. Warm and easy and entirely familiar. "I was watching something on television," he said, and there was a segment about a missing child case in Ohio that the police had just closed after 17 years. And it made him think of me, and he just wanted to check in and see how I was doing. A missing child case. He was calling me about a missing child case. I sat at the kitchen table, and I performed the role of Walter Drummond, grieving father, with the same precision I brought to 31 years of audio engineering. I said I was doing okay. I said I appreciated him calling. I said it was hard sometimes, the not knowing, but you found ways to keep going. He said he knew. He said I was one of the strongest people he had ever met. He said what he always said, near the end. In the particular cadence, I could have predicted word for word. She's out there somewhere. Brother, I know it. I said, yeah. Maybe you're right. He said, get some sleep. I said I would. We hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes without moving. The phone was still in my hand. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car went past on the street, headlights sliding across the ceiling. And then it was quiet again. I put the phone down, went to bed, did not sleep. I was at the studio at 7 the next morning. Ellie had an 8 o'clock session, one she had added to the schedule at the last minute. Something about wanting to try an alternate arrangement on one of the tracks before the showcase. I set up the booth and ran the levels and waited. She arrived at 7:50. Said good morning with the directness of someone who doesn't perform cheerfulness, but also doesn't withhold it. Set up in the live room. Did her warm-up. We ran through 2 takes of the arrangement she wanted to try, and it wasn't working, and she knew it wasn't working, and she said so plainly, and asked if we could go back to the original structure. I said, of course. The 3rd take of the original arrangement was something. I've been doing this for 31 years, and I know when a vocal performance crosses from good into something else, something that has a quality of truth in it that technical skill alone cannot produce. She had it on that take. Something in her voice that was reaching for something real and finding it. I sat in the booth and listened, and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter. Something that had to do with the specific fact of her existence, of this person in this room, alive and whole, and making something beautiful, regardless of everything that had been done and not done in the years between. When she finished, she looked through the glass at me for a read on the take. I gave her a thumbs up. She nodded and reached for her water bottle, and I turned back to my console and did not let her see what was on my face. After the session ended and she packed up and left, I sat alone in the booth for a long time. I thought about Anna at 7 years old, asleep on a February night to 7 unfinished notes. I thought about Ellie at 28, finding those same notes on her own, in a studio in Nashville, with no memory of where they had come from. I thought about what it meant that she had kept them, that somewhere in 21 years of living a life that had nothing to do with me, some part of her had held on to something she didn't know was mine. I sat outside that studio door and listened to my daughter exist in the world. And I made myself one promise. Dennis Craw would never make another 2 a.m. phone call to me again without knowing that I knew exactly who and what he was. I called the FBI field office in Nashville the next morning. I had considered this step carefully. Kowalski's documents were compelling, but they were not, on their own, sufficient for a criminal case. A private investigator's timeline and a set of financial records obtained through channels that Kowalski had declined to specify were not the same thing as evidence that would hold up in federal court. I needed someone with the authority and the institutional resources to do what I couldn't do on my own, to access the sealed portion of the adoption record, to formally connect the financial trail to a criminal act, to build something that would survive scrutiny. The agent who called me back that afternoon was named Patricia Haynes. 12 years with the Bureau, currently assigned to the Violent Crimes Against Children Unit out of the Nashville field office. She had a voice that was professional, without being cold. The kind of voice that has delivered difficult news enough times to understand that efficiency and compassion are not mutually exclusive. She asked me to come in the following day. I sat across from her in a small conference room on the 4th floor of the Federal Building on Broadway, and I laid out everything I had. The session at the studio and the 7 notes. The scar on Ellie's wrist and the medical records I had managed to locate from the urgent care clinic on Charlotte Avenue. Records I had kept in a box with Anna's other documents for 21 years, including the notation of the crescent-shaped laceration on the interior left wrist. 4 sutures. Patient age 6. The adoption file Kowalski had found. The financial records. The timeline. Dennis's credit card statement showing 8 days in Atlanta 6 months after Anna disappeared. Haynes listened without interrupting. She made notes on a legal pad in small, precise handwriting. When I finished, she went back through her notes and asked 3 clarifying questions, each of them precise and practical, the questions of someone who was already thinking about what a case would need to be prosecutable rather than merely credible. Then she told me she needed 2 weeks. 2 weeks to access the sealed adoption records through proper legal channels. 2 weeks to formally verify the financial connections. 2 weeks to build a file that would support an arrest warrant rather than just a conversation. She said I should continue my normal routine during that time. She said I should not contact Dennis differently than I normally would. Should not change any established pattern of communication. Should not give him any reason to believe that anything had shifted. She looked at me across the conference table when she said this last part. Held my eyes for a moment. I understand this is difficult, she said. I need you to understand that if he suspects something before we have everything in place, he has time to destroy evidence, to move assets, to disappear. 2 weeks of normal is the difference between a conviction and a man who walks away. I told her I understood. I told her I had been keeping my face neutral in difficult situations for 31 years, and that 2 more weeks was something I could manage. She nodded, said she'd be in touch. I walked out of the Federal Building into a Nashville afternoon that looked exactly like every other Nashville afternoon, and drove back to the studio and ran a session for 3 hours and did not let any of it show. That was Wednesday. On Friday, Dennis called. Not at 2 in the morning this time. It was 7 in the evening, earlier than usual. And he said he was just checking in, that he'd been thinking about me, that he hoped the week had been decent. Normal? All of it completely normal. I gave him normal back. Told him the week had been fine. Busy with sessions. Nothing remarkable. He mentioned a football game that weekend and asked if I wanted to watch it together. I said sure. Maybe. I'd let him know. Then Ellie's voice came through the glass from the live room, where she was running through a new arrangement with a guitarist I'd brought in. She had taken a different approach to the bridge, something more open than the original version. And there was a moment in it where her voice went somewhere that made the guitarist stop playing and just listen. Dennis heard it through the phone. He asked who that was. I said it was a new artist I was working with. Talented kid. Lot of potential. He said she sounded good. I said yeah. She does. We finished the call. I sat in the booth and watched Ellie work through the arrangement a second time, and then a third, adjusting something small in her phrasing on each pass, chasing whatever it was she was hearing in her head that wasn't quite matching what was coming out yet. 3 days later, she arrived for a session and found me already in the booth and said good morning and set up her things, and then paused by the piano before going into position in front of the microphone. She put one hand on the keys without pressing them, the same gesture she had made the first night I heard her play, and she said, without looking up, "My dad always said music finds you when you need it most." Said it like she was thinking out loud, like it was something that had surfaced unexpectedly. Then she smiled, small and private, and went to the microphone. I kept my eyes on the console. "My dad always said music finds you when you need it most." Dennis Craw, the man who had taken this woman from her home when she was 3 years old, who had spent 21 years living 30 minutes away from me, who had called me at 2 in the morning to tell me my daughter was out there somewhere, who had become, for this woman I was watching through the glass, the source of the wisdom she carried, the voice she quoted when she was thinking about what she believed. He had taken my daughter, and then he had raised her, and she loved him for it. I have spent a lot of time since then trying to find a name for what that feels like. I have not found one that is adequate. The closest I can get is this. It feels like being asked to hold two things at once that cannot both be true, and having to hold them anyway, because reality does not care about your capacity to accommodate it. The hardest thing I have ever done in my life was not losing Anna. It was sitting in a recording booth, watching my daughter through a pane of glass, and pretending I had no idea who she was. 11 more days until Haynes had what she needed. I went home that night and sat at the kitchen table and told myself, out loud, in the empty kitchen, that 11 days was a finite number. That finite number's end. The 2 weeks passed, the way time passes when you are waiting for something you cannot accelerate slowly when you were paying attention to it, and in strange compressed jumps when you weren't. I ran sessions. I logged takes. I adjusted levels and made notes, and had the ordinary professional conversations that fill a working day in a recording studio. I ate meals I don't remember. I slept in fragments. I checked my phone in the way you check your phone when you are expecting a call that will change everything, which is to say compulsively and without real awareness that you're doing it. The studio became, in those 2 weeks, a kind of strange sanctuary. Not because it was comfortable, it wasn't. Not entirely. Not with Ellie there 3 or 4 days a week, and the constant low-level discipline required to be in the same room with someone you were keeping an enormous secret from. But because it was structured, it had rules and rhythms and a clear logic to it. And in a period when everything outside the studio felt provisional and unstable, the work itself was solid. Ellie was in the studio on the Tuesday of the first week for a full-day session. We were working on what she called the difficult one, a track she'd been trying to get right for 3 months, something that kept almost working, and then not quite getting there. The problem, as far as I could identify it from the booth, was that she was performing the emotion rather than locating it. Technically, it was correct. Emotionally, it was slightly outside itself. I said so, carefully. During the afternoon break, I said the performance was good, but it felt like she was standing next to the feeling rather than inside it. She was quiet for a moment, not defensive, just considering. Then she asked what I meant by inside it. I said I meant the difference between knowing what something costs and actually paying it. She looked at me for a moment, and then she went back into the live room, and on the next take, she found it completely. We didn't talk about what she had found or how she had found it. That's not how it works. Some things that happen in a recording studio are better left without explanation. The way certain chemical reactions are better left without analysis. You just let them be what they were and move on. But she stopped on her way out that afternoon and said, without making a particular production of it, that she appreciated the note. Said most engineers told her what was technically wrong and left it at that. Said it made a difference when someone was paying attention to more than the mechanics. I said it was just the job. She said she didn't think so, but she let it go. That was the Tuesday of the first week. By the Thursday of the second week, Kowalski called with the last piece. He had found the bank records he'd been looking for, the ones that showed not just the wire transfer to Mercer and Holt in October of 2003, but a pattern of smaller transactions in the months preceding it. 5 payments between March and August of 2003, each one between $800 and $1,200, each one to a private individual whose name Kowalski had traced to a man who had, according to public records, worked for a decade as a courier and logistics contractor in the Atlanta metropolitan area before retiring in 2007. A courier. Someone who moved things or people from one place to another without asking questions about the nature of the cargo. I sat with that for a long time after the call ended. The payment started in March of 2003. Anna had disappeared in February. Dennis had, within weeks of taking her, begun paying someone in Atlanta to handle whatever logistics were required to move a 3-year-old child through a city without attracting attention, to hold her, to manage her, until the legal paperwork could be arranged. He had not acted alone. He had not been improvising. He had planned it, funded it, coordinated it. And then he had come back to Nashville and sat across from me at the police station while I answered questions about whether my daughter had any enemies and whether there had been any recent changes in the family's routine. I sent everything to Haynes. All of it. The new records, Kowalski's summary, the name of the courier, and his contact information. I sent it at 11:45 at night and sat looking at the sent confirmation on my screen for a few minutes before closing the laptop. Haynes called the next morning at 8. Her voice had the particular quality it had not had in our previous conversations, a forward momentum, a sense of things that had been building now being ready to move. She said the sealed adoption records had been formally accessed through a federal court order the previous afternoon. She said the original intake documentation listed the child's prior name. She said it matched. She said she was ready to move on Wednesday. She said she needed me to make one last call to Dennis on Tuesday evening, to keep the pattern intact, to give her confirmation that he was at his residence and not planning to travel. Standard operational procedure before an arrest. Wednesday, she said. We move Wednesday morning. I said I understood. After the call, I sat in my truck in the studio parking lot for 10 minutes. Wednesday was 2 days away. 48 hours of continuing to be the Walter that Dennis had always known, the grieving father, the loyal friend, the man who trusted completely and questioned nothing. 48 hours until the version of my life that Dennis had constructed, carefully and deliberately, over 21 years, would begin to come apart at the seams he had always believed were invisible. I thought about Anna at 7 years old, asleep in a blue-carpeted room, trusting completely that the world she went to sleep in would be the same world she woke up in. I thought about Ellie at 28, walking out of my studio that afternoon with a vocal take she had finally found, carrying inside her a melody she didn't know she remembered, moving through a life she believed was entirely her own. Wednesday, I had 48 hours left to be the man Dennis thought he still controlled. Tuesday came in the way of days you have been dreading suddenly. Despite all the time you spent watching it approach, I spent the morning at the studio wrapping up a mix that a client needed by end of week. Routine work, the kind that occupies the hands and leaves the mind free to run wherever it wants to go, which on that particular Tuesday was not a useful quality. I kept making small errors, wrong fader, wrong channel, wrong level, the kind of errors that accumulate when the part of your brain responsible for technical precision is occupied with something else entirely. I caught each one before it became a problem, but the catching of them required effort that should not have been necessary. Ellie was not in the studio that day. She had texted in the morning to say she was working on new lyrics and would be in Thursday. I had replied, "Fine. See you Thursday," and sat looking at the message for longer than was necessary, thinking about Thursday, about what Thursday would look like, about what the world would be by Thursday, and who in it would know things they did not yet know. I left the studio at 4 in the afternoon, drove home, made dinner, ate it at the kitchen table while the evening news played on the television in the next room. A city council dispute, a weather system moving in from the west, a human interest piece about a Nashville high school that had just produced its first state championship debate team. The ordinary inventory of a city's Tuesday evening, indifferent to the fact that somewhere across town, a man named Dennis Craw was watching the same broadcast, or something like it, entirely unaware that the last full day of his life as a free man was concluding normally. I washed the dishes, dried them, put them away. At 9, I called Haynes, as we had arranged. Confirmed that Dennis had been at his residence since at least early afternoon. Kowalski had been sitting on the street outside his house since noon at Haynes's request, and Dennis had not left. His car was in the driveway. Lights were on in the living room and the bedroom. No unusual activity. Haynes confirmed the arrest team would be in position by 6 Wednesday morning. She said to keep the call with Dennis short, to keep it normal, and to call her immediately after it ended. I sat in the living room after I hung up with her. The television was still on in the background. I turned it off. The house went quiet in the particular way of houses that are used to one person living in them, not lonely exactly, just complete in its quietness. Settled into it. At 11:43 my phone rang. Dennis. I had known he would call. He called on Tuesday nights often enough that it wasn't unusual, and he had mentioned earlier in the week that he wanted to check in before the end of the week. I had known it was coming, and I had been preparing for it all day, in the way you prepare for something by not letting yourself think about it directly. I answered on the second ring. Hey, brother. His voice. The same voice I had known for 36 years. Warm and unhurried. The voice of a man who had never had any particular reason to be in a hurry, because things had always worked out for him. How's the week been? Good, I said. Busy. Got a mix due Friday. Been spending most of the day in the booth. How about you? Not bad, he said. Had a decent week at work. Carol made that lasagna I like. Nothing remarkable. Nothing remarkable. He said it easily, the way you say it when it's true, when your week has in fact contained nothing remarkable. When you have eaten lasagna, your wife made and watched television, and gone to bed, and woken up the next morning without a federal arrest team positioned around your house. I asked about his back. He'd had a disc issue that had been bothering him for a few months. He said it was a little better. The physical therapy was helping. I said I was glad. He said he appreciated me asking. We talked for 11 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock on the microwave from where I was sitting, counting the minutes, keeping them in a part of my mind that was separate from the part running the conversation. 11 minutes of the most ordinary exchange imaginable. Sports. Work. The weather system moving in from the west that we had both apparently seen mentioned on the news. The specific comfort of two men who have known each other long enough to have a language that requires very little translation. Then, near the end, the way he always did, he said it. She's out there somewhere. Brother, I know it. He said it the same way he had always said it, with that particular quiet certainty, that settled and unshakable confidence. The voice of a man who believed completely in what he was saying. I understood now, in a way I had not fully understood until that moment, what that voice had always been. It was not the voice of conviction. It was the voice of control. the voice of a man who had spent 21 years saying something he knew to be true in a way that made it sound like faith. She's out there somewhere. I know it. Of course he knew it. He had always known it. That was precisely the horror of it, expressed in 7 words, repeated over 2 decades. Every single time designed to close a door I might otherwise have pushed against. I held the phone and I breathed, and I waited 1 beat. Just one. The smallest possible pause, invisible in a normal conversation, meaningless unless you were looking for it. Then I said, I know. Dennis, I finally know. There was a fraction of a second where something moved across the line between us. I cannot tell you what it was. Some shift in the quality of the silence. Some infinitesimal change in the atmospheric pressure of a phone connection between 2 men who had known each other for 36 years. Whether he heard something in my voice, whether some part of him registered the specific word I had added, finally I cannot say. It was over before it could be named. He said, "The same as always. Get some sleep, brother." I said I would. We hung up. I sat in the quiet living room for exactly 4 minutes. I know because I watched the microwave clock. At 11:58, I picked up my phone and called Haynes. She answered before the first ring completed. "He's at home," I said. We talked for 11 minutes. Nothing unusual. He has no idea. 4 words came back across the line. Crisp and final. The sound of 2 weeks of careful work arriving at its destination. "We move at 6, she said. I set the phone down on the coffee table, sat back, looked at the ceiling of the living room where I had lived alone for 15 years. The same ceiling I had looked at on 100 bad nights, on the anniversary of Anna's disappearance, on Sarah's birthday after she was gone, on every 2 in the morning when the phone had rung and Dennis's voice had come through the line and told me to keep going. I had kept going, all the way to this. I did not go to bed. There was no point. I had tried sleep during the previous 2 weeks with mixed results at the best of times, and this was not the best of times. I sat in the living room after Haynes's call and watched the clock on the microwave tick from midnight to 1, from 1 to 2, from 2 into the gray territory of early morning, when Nashville outside my windows was as quiet as it ever gets, which is not very quiet, but quiet enough that you can hear your own thinking more clearly than you might prefer. I made coffee at 2:30, sat at the kitchen table with it, watched the steam rise and thin and disappear. I thought about the first time I met Dennis. 1988. A bar in East Nashville. A poker game neither of us was winning. 2 young men with more confidence than evidence who had ended up at the same table by accident and discovered they spoke the same language. I thought about the wedding, the way he had caught me on the altar steps with one smooth movement and turned it into something that looked intentional. Sarah's voice later that evening, slightly above a whisper. I'm so glad he was there for that. I thought about the hospital, 2009, the particular chair in the waiting room where Dennis had sat beside me for 6 hours, while Sarah's situation clarified itself into something we could not argue with. He had not left. He had not suggested leaving. He had just stayed, the way he always stayed, until there was a reason to go. 36 years of memories, a whole architecture of shared history, built on a foundation that did not exist. I understood something in those early morning hours that I had been approaching for weeks, but had not fully arrived at until then. The friendship had been real. That was the part that was hardest to hold. The moments I remembered were real moments. The comfort was real comfort. The loyalty, or what I had experienced as loyalty, it had functioned as loyalty in my life, had produced the same effects that loyalty produces, had sustained me through things I could not have survived alone. None of that was false in its effect. Even if it was false in its origin, Dennis had done a terrible thing. He had also been, in the decades following it, a present and attentive friend. I did not know how to hold both of those things at once. I was not sure it was possible to hold them both at once. I suspected it was one of those problems that does not get resolved so much as slowly accommodated. The way an old injury becomes something you work around, rather than something you fix. At 4, I moved from the kitchen to the back porch. October cold. The kind Nashville produces reliably in the weeks before it tips into actual winter. I sat in the old wooden chair I kept out there and looked at the backyard in the dark. The oak tree Sarah had planted the first spring we lived in the house. The garden bed that had not been a garden in 15 years. Just a rectangle of soil that kept the shape of what it used to be. The fence at the back where the boards had gone gray with age, and 2 of them had come loose in a storm 3 summers ago, and I had fixed them one afternoon and thought about Anna the whole time. About whether she would have been old enough by then to help, whether she would have wanted to. The sky went from black to the particular dark blue that comes just before the light decides to arrive. I watched it change. There is something about being awake for that transition that feels like a form of honesty. You don't get to skip over it. You have to sit inside it. The long, difficult stretch between darkness and morning. At 5:45, I went inside and changed my shirt and made fresh coffee. At 5:58, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone face up in front of me. 6 o'clock came. Nothing. 6:04. Nothing. 6:11. Nothing. This is the part that no one tells you about. The waiting after the waiting. The way time moves differently when something inevitable is nonetheless not yet confirmed. I knew the arrest team was there. Kowalski had confirmed their position the night before. I knew the warrant was valid. The evidence was sufficient. The operation was as solid as these things can be made to be. I knew all of it, and none of it made the clock move faster. 6:23. 6:31. At 6:49, I got up and rinsed my coffee cup and stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard in the early morning light. The oak tree, the old garden bed, the gray fence boards. All of it exactly the same as it had been at 4 in the morning, and the same as it had been for 15 years before that. The world does not adjust its appearance to match the significance of what is happening in it. It just continues looking like itself, indifferent and complete. My phone rang at 8:47. Haynes. I answered immediately. Her voice was level and precise, and carried in it the quality of someone reporting the conclusion of something that had required a great deal of work to reach. "We have him," she said. "Taken into custody at his residence at 7:18 this morning. He denied everything initially. His attorney has been contacted. He is currently being processed." I stood at the kitchen window with the phone against my ear and looked at the oak tree Sarah had planted. "And Carol," I said. Haynes paused for just a moment. "Carol Craw was present at the residence," she said. She was not aware. She was the pause again. Careful, she was significantly distressed. She is not facing charges. There is no evidence she had any knowledge of the circumstances of the adoption. I thought about Carol. Quiet Carol, kindergarten teacher. The woman who had wanted a child so desperately that her husband had gone and taken one from someone else without telling her. Who had spent 21 years raising a daughter she had believed was legally and rightfully hers. Who was sitting somewhere right now, in her own home, in the wreckage of a morning that had started like every other morning and would never resemble any morning she had known before, Some damage spreads in directions the person who caused it never anticipated, or maybe didn't care to anticipate. I thanked Haynes. She said she'd be in touch about next steps, about Ellie, about the formal process of what came next. I said I understood. We ended the call. I set the phone down on the counter. Looked out the window at Nashville going about its Wednesday morning. Cars on the street. Someone walking a dog on the sidewalk across the way. A delivery truck making a stop 2 houses down. The ordinary motion of a city that had no idea anything had changed. I was the only thing that was different, and I had no idea yet how different everything was about to become. Haynes called again at 2 in the afternoon. I was at the studio by then. I had gone in at 10, not because I had sessions scheduled, but because sitting at home had become something I did not know how to do that day. The studio was familiar in the way that familiar places become necessary during unfamiliar times. I had made coffee in the small kitchen at the back and sat in the empty booth and looked through the glass at the live room where nothing was happening. And it had been enough. Just being somewhere that made sense. When Haynes called, I was still in the booth. I answered immediately. She said Dennis had initially denied everything. Said it was a standard response, what she expected, what his attorney would have advised. But the documentation was substantial, and the sealed adoption records had been formally accessed, and the original intake file listed a child with no prior documented identity, no known family, no explanation for how she had arrived at the private adoption agency, except through the referral of a man whose name appeared on financial records alongside wire transfers to the processing law firm. By 11 in the morning, she said, Dennis had begun talking. I want to know what he said. I told her. She read from her notes. Methodically, without editorializing. The way a professional delivers information she understands to be painful, but believes the recipient has the right to hear directly. Dennis had begun planning in the spring of 2002. The adoption agency rejection had been, in his accounting of it, the final confirmation of something he had already been considering in a more abstract way for several months before that. He said he had watched Anna at family gatherings and become convinced his word. Convinced that she was the right child. He said he had spent months identifying the logistics, the courier, the law firm, the window of opportunity. He said he had waited for a period of disruption, a time when Walter's attention would be sufficiently divided that the absence might not be immediately traced to anything specific. Sarah's diagnosis, I said. Haynes paused. Yes, she said. He identified your wife's diagnosis as the operational window. He had used Sarah's cancer as cover, had looked at the worst thing that had ever happened to my family, and seen in it a scheduling opportunity. Had waited until I was sitting in oncology, waiting rooms and reading pamphlets about treatment options, and then he had moved. I sat in the booth and looked through the glass at the empty piano in the live room. Haynes continued. Dennis said he had not anticipated the duration or the intensity of my search. He said he had expected, within the first 2 or 3 years, that I would accept that Anna was gone and that the investigation would wind down to the point where the risk of discovery was negligible. He said the continued searching had required ongoing management. The phone calls, the presence, the regular maintenance of my trust and my grief. Management. That was the word he had used. I asked Haynes to read it back to confirm. She did. Management. 21 years of 2 in the morning phone calls. 21 years of she's out there somewhere. Brother. 21 years of being the person who stayed. All of it described, in his own accounting, as management. And the justification. I said, Haynes was quiet for a moment. He said he convinced himself he was giving her a better life. She paused. He said, "You were too consumed with grief to be a good father." That Anna, he used that name. Not Ellie, that Anna would have had a difficult life if she had stayed. He said he and Carol had given her stability and opportunity and love. He said he believed he had done the right thing. I put the phone down on the console without ending the call. Not deliberately. My hand just stopped working in the way hands sometimes stop working when the rest of the body has absorbed more than it can process in real time. I sat and looked at the piano through the glass for what was probably 30 seconds but felt longer. Then I picked the phone back up. "Too consumed with grief," I said. Haynes said yes. That was his characterization. I had been too consumed with grief to be a good father. The grief that he had created. The grief that he had then managed. For 21 years. Through strategic phone calls and careful sympathy. He had taken Anna because he decided I was not adequate. And then he had spent 2 decades cultivating and monitoring the grief his decision had caused. And then he had used that grief as retroactive justification for the decision. I closed my eyes, counted to 5, opened them. "Thank you for telling me," I said. My voice was steady. 31 years of keeping your face neutral in difficult situations is training that does not fully abandon you even when everything else is falling apart. Haynes said there would be formal charges filed by end of day. Kidnapping, child abduction, filing false legal documents, obstruction of an ongoing missing persons investigation. She said the district attorney's office was reviewing the case for additional charges. She said Dennis would appear before a federal magistrate the following morning for arraignment, and that bail would almost certainly be denied, given the nature of the charges and the length of the conspiracy. She said Ellie would need to be formally notified. That was the next step. She asked if I wanted to be present when that happened. I thought about it. About Ellie's face when she heard. About what it would do to her to learn that the man she had called Dad for 28 years had built her life on someone else's loss. About whether my presence would be a comfort or an intrusion in that moment. About whether I had any right at all to be in the room when her world came apart. "I don't think I should be there," I said. "That's her moment, not mine." Haynes said she understood. Said she would handle it with care. We ended the call. I set the phone on the console and sat in the empty booth for a long time. The live room was still quiet through the glass. The old upright piano sat in the corner, lid closed, unchanged. I got up eventually and walked around to the live room and sat down on the bench in front of it. Did not open the lid. Just sat there with my hands in my lap in the silence of a room that was very good at holding silence. Too consumed with grief to be a good father, I had been grieving for Anna. I had been grieving in the only way I knew how, which was to keep looking, to keep the tip line open, to update the database photos, to pay the investigators, to stay on the phone with Dennis at 2 in the morning when the grief became unbearable. I had been doing all of that. For 21 years I had been doing all of that. And the man who watched me do it had decided it made me inadequate. I walked out of the studio into the October afternoon and stood in the parking lot and looked at the sky for a long time. Nashville around me, ordinary and complete. I did not scream. I did not collapse. I was not capable of either of those things in that moment. I was too far past the point where emotion takes dramatic forms. What I felt was quieter than that, and much harder to name. Something that had to do with the specific weight of 21 years lived inside a lie that someone else had built and furnished and maintained on my behalf. He had built something. I would give him that much. He had built it carefully, and he had maintained it well, and it had stood for 21 years. The question now was what got built in the space it had occupied, and whether the person who was supposed to help answer that question would ever be ready to have that conversation. I drove home, made dinner, ate it, watched the October dark come down over the backyard, the oak tree going still in the evening air, the old garden bed holding its shape, the gray fence boards. Ellie would know by tomorrow. And then everything that came next would be her decision to make, not mine. Haynes called Thursday morning to tell me it was done. She had gone to Ellie's apartment the previous evening. She had brought a colleague with her, a victim services specialist, whose job was to be present in exactly these kinds of conversations, the ones where a person's understanding of their own life changes completely in the space of a few minutes. She said Ellie had opened the door and looked at the two of them and said, before either of them had spoken a word, "Is this about Dennis?" I don't know how she knew. Maybe she had seen something on the news. Maybe something in the previous weeks had shifted in a way she couldn't name, but had registered anyway. Maybe it was simply that Ellie Craw was the kind of person who had always been good at reading the shape of a situation before it revealed itself directly. That quality, I had come to understand, was not something she had acquired. It was something she had always had. Haynes said she had walked Ellie through it carefully. The investigation, the evidence, the original adoption file and what it contained. The fact that the man she had known as her father had taken her from a family in Nashville when she was 3 years old and had spent 21 years raising her as his own, while the man whose daughter she actually was had been looking for her without knowing where to look. Ellie had not cried, Haynes said. She had sat on her couch with her hands in her lap and listened to everything and asked 2 questions. The first was whether Carol had known. Haynes had told her no, that Carol had been entirely unaware, that Carol was also a victim of what Dennis had done. The second question was whether Dennis had said anything about why. Haynes had told her what Dennis had said. The planning, the adoption agency rejection, the window of opportunity, the justification he had offered. After that, Ellie had asked Haynes and her colleague to leave. Not unkindly, Haynes said. Just clearly. She had thanked them for telling her, and she had stood up and opened the door, and they had gone. I spent Thursday not knowing what to do with myself. I went to the studio because going to the studio was what I did, and I sat in the booth, and I looked at the piano through the glass, and I thought about what it costs a person to have their life reordered at 28 years old. Not just the facts of it, the father who was not her father, the name that wasn't her name, the history that had been constructed around a theft she did not know she was the subject of, but the deeper reordering, the way you understand yourself through the stories you have been told about where you came from, and what happens when those stories turn out to have been built on something that was never yours to begin with. I had no way to know how Ellie was sitting inside that. I only knew that she needed to sit inside it without me, and that the most useful thing I could do was to not exist in her vicinity until she decided otherwise. Friday passed. Saturday. I checked my phone with the compulsive regularity of someone who understands that checking it will not make anything happen faster, but cannot stop anyway. I kept the ringer on at all times, including at night, which I had not done in years. I slept badly and ate irregularly, and spent most of the weekend at the studio working on mixes that did not particularly need working on. Sunday evening, at 7:42, my phone buzzed. A text message. Number I recognized as Ellie's. I need some time. Please don't contact me. 8 words. I read them 4 times. Then I set the phone face down on the kitchen table and sat there for approximately 10 minutes, doing nothing in particular. Then I picked it up and opened the message again and typed a response. I understand completely. Take whatever time you need. I read it back. Deleted it. Typed, of course. I'm not going anywhere. Read it back. Deleted it. Typed, I've waited 21 years. I can wait longer. Take all the time you need. Read it back 3 times. It was too much. It put weight on her that she had not asked to carry. I deleted it. I sat at the kitchen table for another 5 minutes. Outside the window, the Sunday evening was doing what Sunday evenings do, going dark slowly. The street lights coming on one by one, the neighborhood settling into the particular quiet that precedes the work week. I typed 4 words. Take all the time. Read it back. Added 3 more. I'm not going anywhere. 7 words total. I read them twice. Then I hit send before I could change my mind again. The message showed delivered. Then read. A few seconds later. No response came. I put the phone in my shirt pocket and washed the dishes from dinner. Dried them. Put them away. Made tea I did not particularly want, and sat with it at the kitchen table while the evening completed itself outside the window. She had read it. That was something. She knew I was there. She knew I was not going to push. She knew that the 7 words I had sent were the truest thing I could offer her in that moment, which was the simple fact of availability without demand. I am here. I am not leaving. The timing is yours. I had spent 21 years looking for her in places she wasn't. I could spend whatever additional time was required looking for her in the place she actually was, which was a Nashville apartment 3 miles from my studio, working through the most difficult thing that had ever happened to her, at her own pace and on her own terms. Monday morning, I went to the studio, ran a session, logged the takes, did my job, checked my phone every hour, heard nothing, told myself that nothing was not the same as no, that a person who needed time and asked for it clearly was a person who was processing something real and doing it honestly. That honesty, even when it looks like silence, is something to be grateful for. Told myself that 3 days of silence from a daughter I had been separated from for 21 years was not a long time. Some days I almost believed it. 3 weeks is 21 days. I know because I counted those too. The same way I had counted the days of 21 years, not with obsession, just with the particular awareness of someone who has learned that time is not as abstract as it pretends to be. It has weight. It has texture. 3 weeks of silence from a person you have been waiting for your whole life feels different from 3 weeks of anything else. The studio was quieter without Ellie in it. I had not expected that. I had known her for a matter of weeks, had worked with her professionally, had maintained a careful distance in every interaction, and yet, the days she wasn't there had a different quality from the days she had been. As if the room knew something had been altered and had adjusted its acoustics accordingly, I ran sessions, other artists, other projects, the ordinary workflow of a working recording studio in October and November, a country duo finishing their 2nd album, a songwriter laying down demos for a publishing pitch, a young man with an impressive voice and no idea yet how to get out of his own way, who would figure it out eventually if someone kept giving him room to try. I did my job. I was present in the way that the job required, but the piano in the corner of the live room was something I could not stop being aware of. On the Tuesday of the 2nd week, I came in early, before anyone else arrived, and sat down at it. I had not played in years. My instrument had always been the board, the mixing console, the technical architecture of recorded sound. Piano was Sarah's territory. something she had played with genuine skill and quiet pleasure on Sunday mornings while I made breakfast, and Anna sat on the bench beside her and watched her hands. I had no real technique, just the ability to find notes. I lifted the lid, put my right hand on the keys, played the 7 notes. Slowly, one at a time. The way you test something fragile. They sounded the same as they always had. The same ascending phrase, the same gentle resolution at the top, the same quality of incompletion at the end. The melody that had nowhere to go after the 7th note, because I had never figured out where it wanted to go. And then Anna had fallen asleep. And then the next morning had arrived and taken the question somewhere I couldn't follow. I sat with my hand on the 7th key for a long time. The studio was quiet around me. Nashville outside was doing what Nashville does at 6:30 in the morning, waking up slowly, engines starting. The first deliveries of the day moving through streets that were not yet busy. I lifted my hand, closed the lid, went to the booth and made coffee and started the workday. The sentencing happened on the Thursday of the 3rd week. I know because Haynes had sent me the date and time by email, and I had put it in my calendar. And then, when the day came, I had gone to the studio and run a session, and not gone to the courthouse. I had considered going, thought about it seriously, over several days, and arrived at the same conclusion each time. I did not need to see Dennis Craw in a courtroom to know what had been done, or to understand what it meant. I had all the information I needed. What I didn't need was to sit in a room with him and watch justice be administered and feel whatever I would feel in that moment, in a room full of people I did not know. Haynes texted me the outcome at 2:17 in the afternoon. 18 years. Federal sentencing guidelines. Kidnapping charge carrying the heaviest weight. Obstruction and fraud charges adding to the total. He would be 64 years old when he entered custody. He would be in his early 80s when he was eligible for release, assuming standard considerations applied. I read the text, put the phone in my pocket, finished the session I was running, thanked the artist, closed up the booth. 18 years. The same number of years that Anna had been gone before she showed up in my studio, humming a melody she didn't know she remembered. The symmetry of it was the kind of thing that means nothing and feels like it should mean something, which is the nature of most symmetry. The call came on a Friday evening in the 4th week. I was at home, at the kitchen table, doing nothing in particular, reading something I wasn't retaining, half watching the light change outside the window. My phone lit up on the table next to me. Unknown number. In 21 years of keeping a tip line active, I had answered a great many unknown numbers. Most of them led nowhere. Some of them led somewhere painful. A few, over the years, had led somewhere that felt briefly like hope before it turned out to be something else. I answered, "Mr. Drummond." The voice was smaller than I expected. Not smaller in volume, she wasn't whispering, but smaller in some other way. Like a person calling from somewhere far away, testing whether the connection would hold. "Can we meet?" The kitchen went very still around me. The light outside the window. The sound of a car passing on the street. "Yes," I said. Just that one word. The same word she had used in her message 3 weeks ago. I need some time. And I had respected it completely. And now she was calling. And there was only one thing to say in response to "Can we meet?" And that word was yes. She said she knew a place. A coffee shop she liked, not far from where she was staying. She gave me the name and the neighborhood. She said Saturday morning. 9 o'clock, if that worked. It worked, I said. She said okay. She said she would see me then. She ended the call. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat there for a moment in the quiet of the house, that had been quiet for 15 years. Listening to it be quiet in a way that felt, for the first time in a long time, like something that was about to change. She had called. She had asked to meet. She had picked the place and the time and the terms, which was exactly right. Exactly what I would have wanted if I had been given the option of designing how this went. She was not being handed to me. She was choosing to walk towards something, on her own timeline and her own terms. Saturday, I thought. One day away. I went to bed before 10 for the first time in weeks. Did not sleep for a long time. But going to bed felt like the right gesture. Like a man who understood that tomorrow required something of him and was trying, in the most ordinary way he knew how, to be ready for it. I arrived at the coffee shop at 8:40, 20 minutes early. I had not planned to be 20 minutes early. I had planned to be 5 minutes early, which is what I considered appropriate. But I had left the house at 8:15 because sitting at home waiting to leave had become untenable somewhere around 8 o'clock, and the coffee shop was only 12 minutes away. And doing the math on that was not something I had fully thought through before I was already in my truck with the engine running. The place was a small, independent shop on a side street in East Nashville. 6 tables, mismatched chairs, the kind of carefully curated imperfection that takes considerable effort to maintain. A blackboard menu and handwriting someone had practiced. It smelled of coffee and something baked, and the particular warmth of a small room that has been heated by people coming and going through a cold morning. I ordered a coffee I did not need, and chose a table near the back wall with a clear line of sight to the door. Old habit. 31 years in rooms full of equipment you are responsible for tends to produce a specific relationship with spatial awareness. I sat with my coffee and waited. She walked in at 8:58, 2 minutes early. The door opened, and the November cold came in with her for a moment, before the door closed again. And she stood just inside the entrance, scanning the room. And then she saw me, and our eyes met, and neither of us moved for a second that lasted longer than a second. She looked different outside the studio. In the studio, she had always been in motion, adjusting, preparing, performing, thinking through something musical in the visible way of people whose inner processing is connected directly to their physical presence. Here she was, still. She wore a dark jacket, and her hair was down, and she had the particular quality of someone who had not slept well, but was not going to let that be the first thing you noticed about her. She crossed the room and sat down across from me without a greeting. Not unfriendly. Just direct. She set her bag on the empty chair beside her and put both hands around the coffee cup she'd carried in from the counter she had ordered before coming to the table. I realized, which meant she had been outside the door for a few minutes before she walked in. We sat across from each other for a moment without speaking. I had rehearsed things to say, several versions of an opening, ranging from practical to emotional, all of them abandoned somewhere in the previous 24 hours because every version I tried felt like it was about me rather than about her, and this meeting needed to be about her. She spoke first. "Tell me about my mother," she said, not what I had expected. Not the logistics, not the investigation, not what happened, not what comes next. My mother. As if she had been sitting with a list of questions for 4 weeks and had arranged them in order of importance and had arrived at the top of the list. I sat with it for a moment. Then I started to talk. Sarah played piano. I said, Sunday mornings. Mostly. She was genuinely good at it. Not in a performance way, but in the way of someone who had been playing since childhood and had let the skill settle into her hand so completely that it looked like breathing. She had opinions about music specific, considered opinions, and she was not shy about them. She thought most popular music of the past 20 years was technically accomplished and emotionally timid. And she said so when asked, and sometimes when not asked. Ellie was listening in the particular way she listened completely, without performing attentiveness, just actually there. She was funny, I said. Dry. She didn't tell jokes. She just said things, regularly, that made you laugh without warning. She was the most organized person I've ever known, and also somehow always running slightly late, which was a contradiction she refused to acknowledge. She had very strong opinions about how to load a dishwasher. She was right about it, and she knew she was right, and she did not make a great deal of it. Ellie's hands were still around her coffee cup. She said, quietly, "Did she know about me?" I told her the truth. I said Sarah had not known she existed. That Anna, that she had disappeared before Sarah's diagnosis, and that the search for her had been, for both of us, one of the defining facts of our lives, and that Sarah had died not knowing. That the last thing Sarah had said to me, clearly and deliberately, was keep looking. Ellie looked at the table for a moment. Then back at me, she said, "What happened the morning I went missing? Tell me what actually happened." I told her, from the beginning, the night before the dinner, the homework, the melody, Anna falling asleep, waking up in the morning, calling her name from the bottom of the stairs, going up, the empty room, the made bed, the unlocked back door, the way time moves differently in those first minutes when you understand something is wrong but have not yet understood how wrong. I did not soften it. I did not skip the part where I called Dennis before I called the police, which was something I had never said out loud to anyone. I did not skip the part where I had trusted, for 21 years, exactly the wrong person. I told it the way it happened, plainly, with the particular honesty of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally arrived at the right place to put it down. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. The coffee shop moved around us, someone ordering at the counter, two women at the table near the window, talking about something that required lowered voices, a barista grinding beans with the focused indifference of someone performing a task for the 4,000th time. The ordinary world, conducting it Saturday morning. She said, "I don't know what to call you." She said it simply, without apology or discomfort. Just a statement of fact, the kind of honesty that comes from someone who has decided that accuracy is more useful than performance. I looked at her across the small table. This woman who was my daughter. This person I had been looking for in all the wrong places for 21 years, who had been 400 miles away, learning to sing, carrying a melody she didn't know was mine, becoming someone I had not been there to watch her become. "You don't have to call me anything," I said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. That's okay, too." She looked at me for a moment. Something in her expression shifted by a very small amount, not softening exactly, but adjusting. The way a room adjusts when someone opens a window and the air changes without the temperature changing. She picked up her coffee and drank from it. Set it down. Asked me how long I had been running the studio. I told her 11 years. She asked what I did before that. I told her session work, mostly. The long itinerant career of a sound engineer who was good at his job and not particularly interested in being anything other than good at his job. She nodded, said that made sense. We talked for an hour and 40 minutes, about music mostly, and about work, and about the specific pleasures and frustrations of Nashville as a place to build a career in sound. We talked about Sarah a little more, She asked 2 more questions, both specific, both carefully chosen, and I answered them as fully as I could. We did not talk about Dennis. Neither of us introduced him into the conversation, and neither of us needed to. He had taken up enough space already. When she stood to leave, she put on her jacket and picked up her bag and looked at me from standing height. "I don't know what this is yet," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know," I said. "I don't either." She nodded once, headed for the door, stopped with her hand on it, half turned back. "The music," she said. "The 7 notes. I've been humming it my whole life, and I never knew where it came from." "I know," I said. She looked at me for one more moment. Then she pushed through the door into the November morning and was gone. I sat at the table for a while after she'd left, finished my coffee, watched the street through the window. People moving past on the sidewalk, collars up against the cold. The ordinary Saturday morning motion of a city that did not know or care that a father and daughter had just sat across from each other in a small coffee shop and talked for the first time about who they were to each other, and arrived at no conclusions, and needed to arrive at no conclusions, and had been honest about all of it. It was enough. For that morning, in that small room, it was exactly enough. The second meeting happened 11 days later. Ellie texted on a Wednesday evening not to arrange anything specific, just a message that said she had a question about a technical issue with a recording she was working on at home, and was I available to talk through it? I said yes. She called. We talked for 22 minutes about microphone placement and room treatment, and the specific problem of recording vocals in a space with too much parallel surface area, which is a common issue in apartments, and a solvable one if you understand what the room is doing to the sound. It was a completely practical conversation. It was also, I understood, a bridge, a way of making contact that had an objective purpose, and therefore required no emotional navigation beyond the practical. She was not ready for another conversation like the one in the coffee shop. She was offering me something different, a smaller door, a less consequential threshold. I was grateful for it, and I did not say so, because saying so would have made it into something it was not trying to be. She came back to the studio the following Monday. I had not suggested it. I had not asked when she would be back or indicated in any way that her absence had registered with me, though it had, considerably. She simply appeared at 9 in the morning with her thermos and her notebook of lyric sheets, and said good morning, and went into the live room and started her warm-up. And I went into the booth and started the board, and we worked for 6 hours on 3 songs she wanted to have ready for a showcase in January. The work was good. Better than good. On the 3rd song, she found something in the bridge that she had been looking for since the summer, a phrasing that unlocked the whole emotional architecture of the piece. And when she heard it played back, she went quiet in the way musicians go quiet when they recognize something is finished, complete, no longer requiring anything from them. I told her it was the best thing she'd recorded since she'd been in the studio. She said she thought so too. We did not speak of anything personal that day. We did not need to. The work itself was a form of communication that neither of us had to translate. She came back Thursday, and the following Monday. And the Thursday after that, a rhythm developed without being discussed, the way rhythms in studios develop through repetition and mutual agreement that the repetition is working. She would arrive. We would work. We would have the conversations that the work produced, and occasionally, in the breaks, we would have other conversations, about music mostly. Her influences, my experiences, the overlap in our thinking about what recorded sound should do to a listener and what it should not do. She had opinions specific and well-considered, and occasionally surprising, and she expressed them directly and without hedging. And I found, without having expected to find it, that I enjoyed disagreeing with her almost as much as I enjoyed agreeing with her. She pushed back when she thought I was wrong. She conceded when she thought I was right. She did not concede when she did not think I was right, which was not always the same thing as when I actually was right. She was. I came to understand in those weeks, formidably herself. Whatever she had been as a child, and I held only fragments of that. 7 years of moments that had been frozen and preserved in amber for 21 years. The person she had become was entirely her own construction. She had built a point of view and a set of values, and a way of moving through the world that belonged to her completely. It would have been easy to take credit for the parts that resembled me. I tried not to. She had made herself, with or without me, and the correct response to that was respect. One afternoon in the 3rd week of December, she was packing up after a session, and she asked, without looking up from her bag, how I had kept going. After Sarah died, after 21 years of the search going nowhere, how does a person keep functioning inside something that has no resolution? I thought about it for a moment. I showed up every day, I said. Even when I didn't want to. Even when showing up felt like the most pointless thing I could do. I made coffee in the morning. I drove to work. I did the job. I came home. I went to bed. And then I did it again the next day. Not because I believed it would lead anywhere, just because the alternative was to stop. And stopping felt like a different kind of loss that I wasn't willing to add to the one I already had. She zipped her bag, looked at me. "That's not nothing," she said. I said I wasn't sure it was much either. She said she thought it was more than most people manage. She left shortly after that. I sat in the empty booth for a while, thinking about what she had said and what I had said, and the particular quality of a conversation that goes somewhere real without either participant fully intending it to. The Wednesday call started the week before Christmas. Not every week, not reliably. Sometimes she would call, and sometimes she wouldn't. And I learned quickly that the weeks she didn't call were not a signal of anything, except that she was busy, or tired, or simply not in a place that evening where a conversation felt like what she needed. I learned to receive the calls that came without loading them with the weight of the calls that didn't. When she called, we talked about work mostly. Her showcase preparations, the label interest that was beginning to develop, the specific logistical challenges of building a music career in a city full of people trying to build music careers. Occasionally about other things, a book she was reading, a neighborhood she had discovered, a restaurant she thought was worth the price, and one that wasn't. The texture of a life being lived in Nashville by a 28-year-old woman who was figuring out who she was in the aftermath of having the ground shifted under her. I listened more than I talked. That was a deliberate choice. I had 21 years of things I wanted to say, and questions I wanted to ask, and all of them needed to wait until she was ready for them, which was not the same schedule as my own readiness. So I listened. I asked questions when questions were warranted, and I did not ask them when they weren't. And I tried, in every conversation, to be something that was useful to her, rather than something that needed things from her. The week before Christmas, she called on a Wednesday evening, and we talked for 40 minutes about a producer she was considering working with, whether his track record suggested he would serve her sound or shape it into something more commercially convenient. I gave her my honest assessment, which was that his recent work had traded emotional specificity for Polish, and that she should think carefully about whether that was a trade she was willing to make at this stage of her career. She said she had been thinking the same thing but wanted to hear it from someone else. I said I was glad I could help. She said she would talk to me next week. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about the phrase she had used. Next week. Not I might call. Not maybe I'll be in touch. Next week. The casual certainty of it. The assumption that next week there would be a call and we would talk. And it would be the kind of conversation where she asked my opinion on something, and I gave it honestly. And she considered it and drew her own conclusions. It was such a small thing. The most ordinary possible exchange between two people who have decided to be in each other's lives. I had waited 21 years for ordinary. It happened on a Thursday evening in January. The showcase had gone well, better than well, from what Ellie told me afterward. 2 label representatives had asked for follow-up meetings. The producer she had decided against working with had apparently been at the showcase and had approached her afterward with revised terms, which she had declined politely and without apparent regret. She was, as she put it, in a good position. Not a settled position. The music industry does not offer settled positions. Only better and worse forms of uncertainty, but a good one. Something was beginning. She had come into the studio that Thursday to do a session that ran long, a full day of work on a new track she was developing. Something she said had started as a demo idea and had grown into something she was taking more seriously. We wrapped at 7 in the evening. The session musician she'd brought in, a guitarist named Marcus, who had worked with me for years and was reliably excellent, packed up his gear and left. The studio coordinator who handled the front desk had gone home at 6. By 7:15, it was just the 2 of us, and the particular quality of silence that a recording studio produces when the work is done, and the equipment is still, and no one is performing anything. I was logging the session notes at the console. Ellie was in the live room, not packing up yet, just moving around the space the way musicians sometimes do at the end of a long session, not quite ready to leave. Not quite sure what they're looking for. Caught in the transition between the focused state of working and the ordinary state of being a person in the world who has to go home and eat dinner. She drifted toward the piano in the corner. The old upright, slightly out of tune, more sentimental than functional. She had walked past it dozens of times over the weeks she had been coming to the studio. She had never sat down at it. Not since that first night when she had come back after everyone left, and I had watched from the dark booth as she played 7 notes she didn't know she remembered. She sat down now. She put her hands on the keys without pressing them. The same gesture as that first night, resting, not playing, as if making contact before committing. I had stopped typing. I was watching through the glass. I do not think she knew I was watching. The booth was dim. She was facing the piano, not the glass. Then she played the 7 notes, slowly. One at a time. The way you play something you are feeling your way toward rather than performing. The same ascending phrase. The same gentle resolution at the top. The same quality of incompletion at the end. The 7th note hanging in the air of the live room with nowhere yet to go. She stopped, kept her hands on the keys, did not turn around. "This is the song, isn't it?" she said. Not a question, a recognition. The specific and quiet certainty of someone who has known something without knowing they knew it, and has just arrived at the moment where the knowing and the understanding finally occupy the same place at the same time. I got up from the console, walked around to the door of the live room, pushed it open and crossed to the piano, and sat down on the bench beside her. There was enough room on the bench for 2 people if they were willing to be close, which we were. She looked at me. I looked at the keys. "Yes," I said. "That's the song." She nodded, moved her hand slightly on the keys without pressing them, making space. I put my hands beside hers on the keyboard. I had not thought about what came after the 7th note. Not deliberately, not in any structured way. I had played those 7 notes at the beginning of task 16, alone in the empty studio in the early morning, and I had stopped at the 7th, because the 7th was where it had always stopped, and I had not known, in that moment, what came next. I knew now. I don't know how to explain that. I am not a spiritual man in any formal sense. I do not have a framework for the experience of understanding something that you could not have understood 5 minutes earlier, except that something has changed in the room, and the change has made the understanding possible. I only know that my hands were on the keys beside my daughter's hands, and the next note was simply there. The way the next word of a sentence you have been searching for is simply there when you stop searching. I played past the 7th note. The melody continued, unhurried, finding its own direction, moving through something that felt like the shape of the previous 21 years. The grief and the searching and the keeping going on. Days when keeping going felt like the least useful thing a person could do. It moved through that, and it came out somewhere else, not resolved in the way of songs that tie themselves too neatly, resolved in the way of things that have found a resting place without pretending the journey was anything other than what it was. Ellie did not play. She sat beside me with her hands in her lap and she listened. The way she listened to everything completely, without performing attentiveness, actually there. When I finished, the room was quiet. She sat with the quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you write that for her?" I turned and looked at her. This woman, my daughter, 28 years old, sitting beside me on a piano bench in a studio in Nashville, in the January dark, having carried 7 notes her whole life without knowing who had given them to her. "I wrote it for you," I said. She looked at the piano keys for a long moment. Something moved across her face that I did not try to name, some internal adjustment too complex and too private to reduce to a single word. Then she lifted her right hand from her lap and placed it over my hand, where it rested on the keys. She did not press down. She just put her hand there. Light. Warm. The weight of it exactly what it was, and nothing more than that. We sat like that for a while, neither of us speaking, the studio quiet around us. Nashville outside the windows going about its January Thursday evening, indifferent and complete. I thought about Sarah, about the Sunday mornings and the piano, and the particular pleasure she took in playing something well in an empty room where the only audience was the music itself. I thought about what she would have made of this moment, this specific and ordinary and extraordinary moment. And I thought that she would have been too practical to call it a miracle, and too honest to call it anything less. I thought about Anna at 7 years old, asleep on a blue carpet, breathing steadily, her whole life still in front of her, in the way that the lives of 7-year-olds are still entirely in front of them, with no evidence yet of what they will cost. I thought about the 21 years between that night and this one. All of it, the grief and the searching, and the failed leads, and the 2 in the morning phone calls, and the keeping going on the days when keeping going was all there was. All of it had led here, to this bench, to these hands, to a melody that had been waiting 21 years to find its ending. Ellie lifted her hand eventually, put it back in her lap. We sat for another minute or 2 without speaking, and then she said, quietly, that she should probably get going, that she had an early morning. I said, of course. She stood, picked up her bag from where she had left it near the door, paused with her hand on the doorframe. "Same time Thursday," she said. "Same time Thursday," I said. She left. I heard the front door of the studio close behind her, the specific sound of it that I had heard thousands of times. And then the parking lot went quiet, and there was just the studio, and the piano, and the January dark outside the windows, and whatever had just happened, settling into the air of the room, the way sound settles when no one is playing anymore. I sat at the piano for a long time, did not play anything else, just sat with my hands in my lap in the quiet, in the place where the melody had finally, after 21 years, found somewhere to go. It has been 8 months since that Thursday evening in the studio. Dennis Craw is in a federal correctional facility in Tennessee, beginning the first year of an 18-year sentence. I do not think about him as often as I expected to. In the years when I did not know what he had done, he had occupied a significant portion of my inner life, the calls, the check-ins, the presence of him as a fixed point in the landscape of my grief. Now that space is quieter, not empty exactly. The scar tissue of 36 years of friendship does not dissolve cleanly, but it has stopped requiring maintenance. Carol Craw is living with her sister in Murfreesboro. I heard this through Haynes, not through any direct contact. Carol had known nothing, had spent 21 years believing her husband was a good man who had helped a child find a home through legitimate channels, and had loved the daughter that home produced with everything she had. She is also a victim of what Dennis did, as complete a victim as anyone else in this story. And I think about her with something that is not quite sympathy and not quite guilt, but exists in the space between those two things, and does not have a cleaner name. Ellie does not call Dennis's name in conversation. She does not call him anything. I don't know what she is working through in regard to him, and I have not asked, because it is hers to work through, and the timeline is hers. What I know is that Carol sent her a letter, and that Ellie told me she had received it, and that she had not yet decided whether she would respond. I said that sounded right. She said she thought so too. She has not called me Dad. I want to be honest about that, because the stories we tell about reunions tend to arrive at their titles quickly, and this one has not. She calls me Walter, sometimes in the studio, when she is talking to someone else and referring to me. She says the engineer, or the studio guy, with a small smile that I understand is affectionate rather than dismissive. She is not ready for a word that carries that much history, and I am not in any position to rush her toward one. I have spent 21 years waiting. I can wait for a word. What I have is this. She calls on Wednesday evenings. Not every week, but most weeks. We talk about work and music and the specific texture of building a life in a city that asks a great deal of the people who choose it. Occasionally, we talk about Sarah. She asks questions when she has them, and I answer as fully as I can, and she sits with the answers in her own time. The label interest has solidified into a development deal that she is cautiously optimistic about, which is the appropriate level of optimism for a development deal. She has opinions about the producer they have assigned to her, and most of those opinions are correct. She is in the studio on Thursdays. We work. We have the conversations that the work produces, and occasionally ones that go somewhere else. The silences between us have become comfortable in the way that silence has become comfortable between people who have stopped needing to fill them with proof that they are all right. 2 weeks ago, she sent me a recording on her phone. A voice memo. Just her and an acoustic guitar, working through something new. The melody was hers entirely. Something I had not heard before. Built on a harmonic structure that was more sophisticated than her earlier work, and emotionally more open at the same time. She sent it without a message attached. Just the file? I listened to it twice. Then I texted back, "This is the one." She replied with a single word, "Duh." That was the whole exchange. It was sufficient. I want to tell you something about what I have learned, because I think that is what you came here for, or part of it, and I want to honor that by saying it plainly rather than dressing it in more language than it needs. I spent 21 years looking for my daughter in the wrong places because I trusted the wrong person to tell me where to look. I do not say this to excuse myself. I was also, for 21 years, trusting a version of my life that I had built on the assumption that the people closest to me were who they appeared to be. That assumption was wrong, and the cost of being wrong about it was enormous, and no amount of subsequent discovery fully recovers what was lost in those years. I know that. I sit with that. But I also know this. I believe in the way that a man believes something when he has seen the evidence of it directly, that God put me through this for a reason. Not a reason that makes the suffering proportionate or the betrayal acceptable. Just a reason. A direction that the suffering was moving in, even when the suffering felt like nothing but itself. I could not have known, in any of those 21 years, that a Tuesday evening in October would bring a young woman to an upright piano in a Nashville recording studio to play 7 notes she had been carrying her whole life without knowing why. I could not have planned for that. I could not have engineered it. It simply happened. The way things happen when they have been building toward themselves for long enough. I believe God keeps better track of these things than we do, and I believe He kept Ellie safe through all of it. Through the years I could not reach her, through the life she built without me, through the particular resilience that allowed her to walk into a coffee shop in November and ask me about her mother with the directness of someone who has decided that truth is worth whatever it costs. She did not arrive at that character by accident. Something was at work in her life that I was not part of, and I am grateful for it in a way that I don't have adequate words for. There are things I will never recover. The years are gone. The Tuesday evenings when she was learning to ride her bike. The Sunday mornings when she might have sat beside Sarah at the piano. The particular, unremarkable accumulation of ordinary days that become, in their totality, a childhood. Those are not coming back. And I have made my peace with that in the imperfect and ongoing way that making peace with something actually works, not all at once, not finally, but gradually, in the way that scar tissue forms, slowly and incompletely, and still. What I have now is real. The Thursday sessions, the Wednesday calls, the silences that have learned to hold themselves without requiring rescue, a melody that waited 21 years to be finished, and then was finished, because the right person sat down beside me at the right moment. If this story has stayed with you, if something in it has touched something in yours, then I want to ask you one thing. Look at the people around you, not with suspicion, not with the particular exhausted vigilance of someone who has learned that trust is dangerous. Just with honesty. Ask the questions that matter. Say the things that need saying. Don't let the comfortable silence become the permanent one, because I can tell you from 21 years of experience that comfortable silence is only comfortable until it isn't. And by the time you discover the difference, it may be too late to say what you should have said when saying it was still possible. Don't mistake silence for peace, and don't mistake loyalty for love, because they are not the same thing, and the difference between them can cost you more than you are prepared to pay. I believe the truth finds its way home eventually. I have seen the evidence of that. I have sat on a piano bench in January dark with the evidence of it beside me, and I have felt what it feels like to have 21 years of searching arrive at an ending that was always waiting. If you are still here, listening, still with me at the end of this, I am grateful, more than I know how to say. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done. Tell me what this brought up for you. Tell me one word for how you are feeling right now. Because I asked you that at the beginning, and I am asking again now. And I think the answer might be different. And I think the difference matters. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who is carrying something they have not yet found the language for. Someone who is waiting for a melody to finish itself. And if you want to stay, if you want more stories like this one, stories about truth and time and the particular stubbornness of love, subscribe to this channel. Turn on the notifications. I will be here. I always show up, even when I don't want to. That's all I know how to do. And tonight, for the first time in 21 years, it was enough. I spent 21 years looking for my daughter in every place except the one she actually was. Not because I didn't try, because I trusted the wrong person to tell me where to look. Here is what I know now. The most dangerous lies are not told by strangers. They are told by people who know exactly how much you need to believe them. Dennis didn't just take my daughter. He took my ability to question him, because questioning him meant losing the only person who seemed to understand what I was carrying. Don't mistake the comfort someone gives you for proof of who they are. A person can hold you together with one hand, while the other hand is the reason you're broken. God put me through this, not because the suffering was justified, but because the searching kept me present. Kept me in that studio on that Tuesday night when she sat down at the piano and played 7 notes that no one alive should have known except me. If I had stopped looking, I would not have been listening, and I would never have heard her. She doesn't call me Dad. Not yet. Maybe she will. Maybe she won't. Both are something I can live with. What I know is this. Last Thursday, she sat beside me at that old piano, and I finally finished the melody. I started the last night she was home. 21 years it sat at 7 notes with nowhere to go. She put her hand over mine on the keys when I was done. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. God is good. Even in the waiting. Even in the silence. Even in the 21 years of not knowing. The melody waited for its ending. So did I. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me. Is there someone you have been afraid to look at too closely? Something you have told yourself is gone that maybe isn't? These stories belong to anyone who recognizes something of themselves in them. If you want to hear more stories about truth, family, and the things that survive even the longest silences, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than I can say.